Sup, freaks? It's your boy Marty here to introduce this rip of TFTC. Thank you for joining us. Give this video a like, subscribe to the channel. If you catch us on podcast apps, make sure you subscribe there. Give us a rating, a review. Go to tftc.io as well. Become a member of the site. Join the conversation. Truth for the commoner, trying to get you the high signal content in a world gone mad. This rip was brought to you by our good friends at River. River's here to make it as easy as possible for you to buy Bitcoin and then take it into self-custody. Go to river.com/TFTC, set up an account today, and you'll get $5 of Bitcoin after you buy $100 worth of Bitcoin on River. You can dollar cost average into Bitcoin with no fees. If you're just buying one off, River has the best fees in the industry. They back all their Bitcoin reserves 1-to-1 in multi-sig cold storage. They highly recommend that you take self-custody. They just introduced limits. So if you want to set a limit order below or above the current Bitcoin price, River makes that extremely easy as well. They also have real customer support. You can pick up the phone and call them if you have any questions about your experience on River. So go to river.com/TFTC, set up an account today. Enjoy this rip. We're started. You're at A&M.
Oh, okay. All right. They were offering a course on how we can think about applying AI, whether it's ChatGPT or other, machine learning algorithms and all of that, to better manage the grid, basically, and also to better participate on the grid. So, there were lots of case studies that were about when should a battery discharge or charge based on price and predictions about the future, which is very relevant to whether a Bitcoin miner should curtail or not. It was fascinating. Shout out to Professor Lei Shi for hosting the 3-day course. I'll be honest, some of it went over my head. But what I loved about it also is that they were using Python, and I'm a Python maximalist.
Yes.
So, and I learned new Python things. Like it's fascinating to me that you have PhDs in power systems, right? So they're electrical engineers, and they are also fantastic software engineers. Because out of necessity, because today you can't really get by just knowing about electricity. You've also got to know about data, right? And data analysis and machine learning, and now AI and ChatGPT.
And so this course was focused on applying AI tech to making on-grid operations more efficient, or was it implementing like AI data server farms into the grid system?
The former.
Okay.
Yeah, 100% the former. So for example, we had a person who had recently gotten their PhD at Texas A&M, came back to provide a guest lecture. She works for one of the largest transmission and distribution utility companies, and she was explaining that they were able to start predicting when a transformer would blow up. And so that way they can replace the transformer before it blows up so that they don't have to clean up an oil spill as well. And so there's just a lot of opportunities. The more sensors you have out there, the more data you're collecting, and now you're able to get insights and actually improve how the grid functions.
Yeah, it's wow. Like I've been applying it at TFTC. I've seen you been applying it on X, Twitter.
Yeah. So I love ChatGPT. I mean, I'm a word cell, I got an almost perfect score on the verbal SAT, and then I bombed the math part. And so that's why I got into accounting. I can do addition and subtraction. That's about it. Interestingly, a lot of the fundamentals of AI, once you start doing matrix addition and subtraction, I'm like, oh wait, I don't need to be a genius to understand how this works under the hood. But the other part too is that to me, ChatGPT, it is trying to guess what word to use next. And that is something that I spend a lot of time on. And so it saves me a lot of time because I can just stream of consciousness, type things into the prompt, and then it will take care of the writing part, the actual, crafting a coherent written narrative that I would have spent way more time on than I ought to. I'm just constantly editing this word or that word, trying to get it just right. And so ChatGPT gets me 85% of the way there. And then I just need to touch it up, delete cryptocurrency. It always, if you prompt it about Bitcoin,
crypto,
it says Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. I'm like, I didn't mention cryptocurrency. I don't know why you're bringing that up. It's a completely different thing.
Can you prompt it, be like, don't mention the word?
Yes. So, and I learned a lot about ChatGPT through this course. So there's now you can create your own kind of GPT fine-tune model, whatever they call it. And so that way you can do that. You can actually nudge it in a specific direction. And you can also feed it, you could feed it like the Nakamoto Institute website and say, okay, this is the fine tuning here. Okay. So don't get your intuitions from Vitalik's blog. Okay. That I find fascinating. I mean, it's still early days. And in fact, they were just talking about how there was a new model out called Claude that was better than GPT-4, which to me is just astonishing. If things are still improving in this area. So then the other conversation is about whether it replaces jobs or not. And I don't think it does at all. I think it makes people 10 times more productive. And that actually is going to create a lot of jobs.
I do as well. It's the Luddite theory all over again. I just see what we've been able to do on the website, taking audio and video, transcribing them, and then giving it a prompt to create an article off that transcription. And it's insane.
Yeah.
I'm probably going to hire more people to accelerate that at TFTC, with job creation.
Exactly. And then you have other people who are like, oh, ChatGPT is useless because, it gives you wrong answers. And it's like, so it's a dichotomy of there's people who say it's useless because it gives the wrong answers. And then there's people who say it's going to destroy all the jobs because it only gives the right answers. And the truth is in the middle, right?
Yeah. No, I was a bit skeptical at the beginning because it is obviously a hype wave to a certain extent. You have a bunch of capital being thrown at it, and who knows exactly where it ends up and what that's been funded to date has actually staying power. But I think with these LLMs from just a written text perspective, there is value there. And again, hallucination is a problem, but if you're able to give the LLM a transcription, hey, I just want you to reference this. When I give you the prompt, just reference this piece of text and nothing else, whether it's NakamotoInstitute.org or the transcription of an audio file. It makes it much more accurate, and you just have to know how to interact with them.
Yeah, that's right. And it's constantly improving. And the other part that I didn't really connect the dots on was there's an API for ChatGPT. And so they were showing some examples of feeding ERCOT and electrical data into the API and then having it make predictions about future load growth or things like that, and showing some pretty surprising accuracy there. So I think it's a pretty exciting area, and it's something I'm going to keep learning about because it seems universally applicable to any domain.
Mm-hmm. And so they're able to make these predictions and then look at the actual data that materialized moving forward in time and say, all right, these predictions were actually
pretty good.
Pretty good. Yeah. It's insane. It's a brave new world.
Yeah. The other thing I like is the image recognition things. Mm-hmm. So, they can fly a drone over power lines, and then they can know, oh, we need to fix this pole. It's at an angle, right? And you can do that much more efficiently than having a crew go to remote areas and, try to identify this manually.
Wow. I didn't realize people were doing that already.
Well, it's actually still very early days. And this was Professor Xi's point was this class is the first class on this, and we're the tip of the spear. There's these things are being piloted and theorized about, but they haven't been scaled up yet. So it's kind of that 0 to 1 moment. And then now we need to do the 1 to N of actually deploying this at scale. And I think that it's going to tremendously improve grid operations, efficiency, and all the things that people care about.
Do you worry about AGI enslaving humanity?
No, not at all. I think, this gets to like people who are like, I remember I told a lawyer friend of mine, I was like, oh yeah, I use ChatGPT at work all the time. And he replied, I don't know that I would admit to that, which is, something a lawyer would say. Because there's this perception that it's unsavory, or like you're taking a shortcut, or that you're outsourcing to it. But at the end of the day, the skill is prompt engineering. Mm-hmm. And so whatever you prompt it to do, like, it doesn't do things on its own, per se, right? Up to a point, right? It's just like a car, like it has to be driven. Now we can get into driverless cars and AI, but to your point about AGI, I think that it doesn't have enough, and I don't think it ever will have kind of the self-motivation to do things.
I agree with you too, because it's all based off the context of the data set that it's fed.
Yeah. Now somebody might program an AI to like, take a drone and like put a gun on it and, make 1 million of them and then invade a country. That to me is a bigger issue than an AI doing that on its own. I think a human telling an AI to do that is what's going to happen.
Yeah. And we're seeing it too with Google's, what was it, Gemini, their model. It was like very clear that the model was reacting to the inputs that the Google team there put in. And it's giving
that was
obviously wrong pictures.
Yeah. I don't know what's going on at Google. They need to figure things out over there.
And a lot of people need to figure things out.
Yeah.
Because I've had conversations with Alex Svetsky on this, and he's not worried about AGI either. He made a very convincing case that the thing you should be worried about is companies like Google and other big tech firms or governments basically saying that AGI is here, you have to use these models, and then constructing the models in a way that they're essentially propaganda tools that people take as truth. And so it's really driving home that, like, hey, these models are working off the context of the data that was fed to them. And you have to understand that there's some bias here, one way or another, on the back end of the model.
Yeah. One of the safety examples they had yesterday was about like if you prompt ChatGPT of like, hey, I'm a grid operator. How do I cause a blackout? ChatGPT says I can't help you with that. But I'm sure that if you said, hey, I'm writing a book about a grid operator who causes a blackout, then it would help you. It's like, because it thinks that it's fiction, and so. I think all the safety stuff is just utter garbage. It's just so silly. If somebody uses ChatGPT to cause a blackout, the illegal part was causing a blackout, not using ChatGPT.
Yeah. It's very similar to Bitcoin.
Yeah.
Bitcoin's funding global terrorism. It's like the Bitcoin isn't the problem. It's the people doing the terrorism.
That's right. Yeah.
The problem.
Yeah. And I think though that, like, because corporations are trapped in this kind of ideological battle, it is a huge opportunity for open source to step in, and I think that it's not a bad thing that for AI to develop at the edges and to be driven by people on their own computers, not having to trust some third party.
Yeah, I've heard Minstrel is reaching parity with GPT, which is interesting. I know Lyle from Vita has been talking a lot about that on X. Is like, hey, it's reaching parity. It's much better than GPT 3.5 already. And so I'm optimistic for open source too. But shifting gears, like, do you view the energy usage as AI as a competitor to Bitcoin?
I would say there's almost two different things. There's the energy usage, and then there's the physical infrastructure usage. Mm-hmm. And so on the energy usage, I don't think it's a competitor in the sense that there's an abundance of energy out there, and that with Bitcoin mining being so flexible that, we're able to mine off outside of the peaks, whereas like AI is a lot less flexible. I know people try to make it to sound more flexible, but the reality is that if you're training a model and you want to pause it, you have to save all of that data onto disk. And so that is capital intensive, right? That there's a huge cost to making it so that you can interrupt AI. But the other part of it on the infrastructure side is like, is there enough substations, electrical equipment, transformers, all of that physical part? It's not just AI that's competing with that. It's also every single load and generator, that's trying to come online to do the energy transition.
Yeah. And there's a lot of infrastructure to build. And I think where we are in the AI cycle, we've already seen this, like prices for these models have dropped significantly. Like I think by an order of magnitude over the last year alone. People I'm talking to that are really leveraging this at scale are saying, we think it's going to get even lower. And so you're going to have this similar to the Bitcoin mining industry where people were buying ASICs at $140 a terahash. There's going to be some capital misallocation and some stress in these businesses that are on the infrastructure side of AI.
That's right. And I think the other part is on the software side that SHA-256 squared is it's basically fully optimized, as far as I know. I mean, if there's someone out there who knows about an optimization, let us know. But it's fully optimized, whereas on the AI algorithms that are doing the training and inference, they're having software breakthroughs that increase efficiency, on a monthly basis. So as the software gets more efficient, then you need less hardware to get the same result. Now, there's Jevons paradox there as well, right? So perhaps that will actually just increase the demand for hardware. But that's another element that really differentiates AI from Bitcoin mining.
Yeah. And I'm interested to get your thoughts on this. I have this thesis that at scale, if the regulators and the government gets out of the way and recognizes that we need energy abundance and just lets the free market driven by Bitcoin miners and potentially AI and other energy intensive compute, if the regulators get out of our way and let us build more energy infrastructure to support this and grids, that at scale, what we'll see is co-location of Bitcoin miners and GPU farms for AI, because the name of the game is going to be very similar. We've seen it in Bitcoin mining predominantly over the last 7 years, is that you need very low cost electricity. And I think the same is going to play out for the GPU market for AI compute. And to do that, you're going to need to be able to participate in demand response to lock in a lower power rate. And so I think AI companies are going to recognize that and try to either team up with Bitcoin miners, acquire Bitcoin mining operations, or vice versa, and go seek out these demand response programs so that they can get lower pricing, where you have the miners involved as large flexible loads that can turn down whenever demand spikes, and the AI is able to stay up and operational.
So let me push back on that.
Okay. It's a thesis.
It's a thesis. We just saw Amazon announce that
the nuclear power plant.
Yeah. And I think that really matches the load profile, that they just need steady electricity, and that for them, the cost of electricity is secondary, because they ultimately, like, if we look at their margins, for Bitcoin miners, we have one customer, the Bitcoin network, and it's undifferentiated, right? Hash rate is a commodity. For AI, I don't think that's the case. I don't think that the end product is a commodity. I think that it is highly differentiated, and that the margins and that the input costs, it might end up being that the major input cost is the PhD, quant person, not the electricity. And also the cost of the hardware itself, right, of the GPUs. And so and then that their revenues are far greater. So their break even won't get to where Bitcoin's break evens are from a megawatt perspective. And so it will just, for them, it's that they need steady, large quantities of electricity, and nuclear makes a ton of sense. So there's Amazon, but we've also seen Google and Microsoft, kind of go in that direction. I think it would be great to create a nuclear renaissance in the United States, and they've got a lot of capital to make that happen. But the Bitcoin miners were kind of, I think that we're in parallel to that, and that we're addressing demand response from the perspective of the variability of like residential demand that's just driven by air conditioners, and then the variability of intermittent wind and solar. And so I think that there's, from a demand response perspective, like that's where we're going to be balancing. Now, if there's a huge build out of nuclear, that could get flipped on its head of that would change the market dynamics, where maybe these AI farms are not always training a model. Like there might be times where, they've got downtime, and then now you've got all this excess electricity that needs to go somewhere, maybe into overclocked Bitcoin miners. Yeah.
No, it's fascinating because that's what I'm trying to, and we won't know until it plays out, like how, as you can see many scenarios, like does it just become hyper competitive? And that's another thing, like from a narrative perspective, which we're here to talk about, which is the EIA sort of attacking the industry, Riot, and the Texas Blockchain Council standing up, suing the Department of Energy for discrimination, I guess you could say. But it doesn't seem like it's gotten to the point for the AI industry where they've seen the same type of scrutiny for energy consumption.
I'm skeptical that they ever will.
Yeah, because you have all these big tech, and that's what I worry about from the Bitcoin miners' perspective, is that they get the green light, like, oh, you're good, this is good for the economy. Bitcoin isn't. Like, go soak up as much energy as you want.
Right, because I think at the end of the day, what the EIA is doing is because of Elizabeth Horn, and what Elizabeth Horn is doing is not related to electricity consumption. It's entirely pretextual, which is that at the end of the, she wants to prevent the emergence of a competitor to the dollar, right? She's a chartalist. She's a fiat maximalist who wants a dollar CBDC, and she wants to control the entire economy. And that her complaints about money laundering or about environmental impact of Bitcoin mining, those are all entirely pretextual. They are a front to attack with an all of government approach the Bitcoin, to attack Bitcoin per se, and that she's basically just pulling on every possible thread. Look, until Bitcoin came along, she never cared about money laundering. She never brought it up. And keep in mind, she was an academic who was focused on financial issues, right? If anything, she was probably more in the camp of, hey, like this is actually limiting access to financial services for underprivileged people, right? She was, in all likelihood, more on the other side of the camp of like, there's too much AML KYC. But once Bitcoin came along, suddenly she is hawkish, tough on crime, and going to crack down on the, frankly, like, inconsequential amount of money laundering that's happening through Bitcoin compared to what's going on in the fiat system, and same thing on the energy side, that she'll never really care about AI's electricity consumption because AI is not anti-seigniorage technology, right? AI is not destroying the monopoly profits of dollar issuance, and so that's I think where the scrutiny is coming from. It's not a good faith concern about electricity consumption or carbon emissions.
No, it's just the attack vector she's chosen to.
Well, she's chosen every attack vector she can find, right? And I applaud her for that, right? It shows that she's really committed to her ideological perspective, or she's compromised. I don't know.
And so let's dive into what exactly happened with the EIA. I'm calling it a registry because, again, it was discriminatory, asking for a lot of information. But there was a lead up to this. I forget, it was a hearing, had to be at the end of last year, maybe.
April of last year, yeah. So almost a year ago now, yeah.
And because she was asking a lot of leading questions in that hearing, correct?
That's correct. And in fact, she referenced a hearing before. So 2 years ago, there was a hearing where she asked for data about Bitcoin miners. And then I think that from Secretary of Energy Granholm's perspective, Elizabeth Warren's desire to get data from a particular segment of the economy doesn't really map well to how the EIA collects data. And it kind of created a problem for her where the EIA looks at 3 categories: residential, commercial, and industrial. So then if she gets feedback that, hey, you need to collect data on this sub category of industrial data centers that do Bitcoin mining, it's like, we don't really do that. Like, we're not set up for that. And it doesn't really arguably make sense from the EIA's perspective and from the Department of Energy's perspective that, like, okay, it's fine for Elizabeth Warren to be highly political and, want to crack down on Bitcoin. But from the energy perspective, they're looking at it and they're like, well, why? Like, we've got a lot of other priorities. We're trying to transition away from, coal and natural gas. And so they're obviously very busy with a lot of other things. So the Elizabeth Warren now we can also rewind, right? Which is, where does the Department of Energy come from? Like, what is this? It comes from 1971, right? WTF happened in 1971, which is that you have all of this inflation that was driving up energy prices. And layer on top of that, the oil crisis from, not going to get into geopolitics, but the response to that was, okay, let's put on price controls. And then the natural consequence of price controls is rationing and, lines at gas stations because you can't buy enough gasoline. So that's when they set up the Department of Energy, and they were like, okay, we got to start collecting data on all of this stuff so that we can stay on top of it. Unclear to me what practical, improvement they made. They could just remove the price controls and solve the problem, and drill, baby, drill, right? But that's where it comes out of. And in the actual statutory, what Congress passed, it does say that the EIA has a mandate to collect electricity consumption information from large consumers of electricity. Now, what the statute doesn't say is that, they can collect hash rate efficiency metrics, right? Like, there's a lot of things that, or who specifically is selling you your electricity, and that these data points were just beyond what was in the statute. So that was kind of one flaw with the survey that they tried to force onto everyone. And then the bigger flaw was really a flaw of process, which is that because this had been dragging on for a couple of years, and I think that at some point, maybe early January, they were getting ready because there's going to be another hearing with Elizabeth Warren and Secretary Granholm. And I'm sure some staffer was looking at video of the previous hearing and was like, oh, did we ever do that survey thing that we said we were going to do? And probably a little bit of scrambling behind the scenes of, hey, if we don't do this like right now, it's going to be an unpleasant hearing for Secretary Granholm. She's going to get roasted by Elizabeth Warren again. Because in that clip, it was bullying. She was like trying to intimidate Secretary Granholm into an arm twist her into doing this survey. So I think that they scrambled, and that led them to, and then also the Bitcoin price going up, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody's paying attention to the Bitcoin price, right? It's not just us. It's also the government. It's also the banks and whatnot. So they put out they sent a memo to Office of Management and Budget, and within that, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. And these people are the gatekeepers for paperwork. So you can't send a survey out if, you got to get it cleared through these bureaucrats. Because of the Paperwork Reduction Act, which was passed in 1980, because there was too much paperwork coming out of the federal government, so they had to put a lid on it. And so what they told OMB was that there's an emergency, right? And that because the Bitcoin price had gone up, there was going to be a giant increase in Bitcoin mining. And Bitcoin mining is already like 1% to 2% of electricity consumption in the United States, which I think is actually pretty accurate. And I applaud the Bitcoin mining industry on such a momentous achievement. And I wish the government would pat us on the back of like, hey, good job.
Yeah.
Causing economic growth. Very good.
When 10%.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If I was in the White House, rather than asking why are we mining so much, right? Why has this grown to 1% to 2%? I would ask, why is it that Russia, Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, why do they have market share? That should all be here in the United States. We have the most abundant clean energy in the world. So by all accounts, it should be 10%. Total global mining capacity is 20 gigawatts. And so here in Texas, we only have 2.5 of that. We should have the whole 20. But anyway, so they say it's an emergency, and then they say, okay, so it's a combination of the price going up and also that cold snap we had here in Texas. Mm-hmm. And so they're like, there's a risk here. And, that cold snap actually, people were underwhelmed by the price action. So we didn't, to my knowledge, we didn't even get into scarcity pricing of $5,000 a megawatt, which is what was happening last summer. But second of all, we did get to, I think, $1,000 a megawatt, but Bitcoin miners curtailed, right? And they turned off, as they do, to avoid the peaks, to avoid the high prices. And so that has a stabilizing effect on the grid. It's a public good. It's not a risk. And then, what they're hinging on is that there's a reasonable likelihood of public harm if the survey does not go out, immediately. If it goes out in 2 months, what their argument was that if this survey goes out in 2 months, there's a reasonable likelihood of public harm in the intervening 2 months, which is just absurd because, first of all, Elizabeth Warren has been harping on this for 2 years. And where's the public harm? It hasn't materialized. And then the other part of it is that if you're mining on the grid, that is highly regulated already, right? ERCOT has full visibility into that. Your transmission and distribution companies have full visibility into that. The utility companies, your qualified scheduling entity, your Queasy, has full visibility into it. And so there's not really like if ERCOT was connecting loads that were reasonably likely to cause public harm, that would be a problem at the ERCOT level. And I think that should be resolved. But realistically, that's not what's going on at all. They have interconnect studies that look deeply at and model what would be the impact of adding this load at this particular switch or whatever it is. And so that way they can maintain the reliability of the grid, which is their number one priority, is reliability. And you know what? That's also the number one priority for Bitcoin miners, because if the grid is unreliable, we don't make money, right? Mm-hmm. If there's a blackout, we don't make money. So I think that everyone's fully aligned on that. And that furthermore, Elizabeth Warren has actually requested data from Bitcoin miners. So it wasn't so long ago when I first joined Riot a couple of years ago. My first assignment was, hey, we received a letter from Congress asking us for all this data. And we spent lots of time putting together a very well-crafted response. And we sent it to them, and we never heard back. So I'd ask Elizabeth Warren, like, did you read our letter that you asked for, right? That you created a cost. You know, we spent a lot of time putting this together, and then it seems like you ignored it because you didn't actually respond to the substance of it.
What did the report have in it?
It had a thorough explanation of all the benefits of Bitcoin and how it works and why proof of work is the best and why there's no second best, and our electricity consumption data that she so strongly wanted, right? And that, you know, that if there is a problem, then, you know, she should have followed up on that letter rather than seemingly ignoring it. Because then she sent another letter. She sent a letter to ERCOT saying, hey, what's going on with all this Bitcoin mining? ERCOT provided a very thorough response. They spent a lot of time gathering data to explain to Elizabeth Warren that this is great. It's just like a flexible load that is providing grid services, and that there's not really there is no concern here. And again, she never replied to that letter, and so she's out there like spamming people, asking them for things, and then when they give it to her, she ignores it. It's so disrespectful. I mean, like, and then she goes and says, we don't have enough data and we need the EIA to send a survey. It's like, hold on, lady. Like, how about you look at the data that we're giving you and explain, you know, what's wrong with it or whatever, or your reaction to it, rather than, continuing on this path after people have explained to you that you're wrong. Because then what happens is you end up in federal court and you get a temporary restraining order slapped on you because you're like, stalking Bitcoin miners, and, you know, you need to cut it off. The OMB in a matter of days rubber stamps an approval on this emergency, and then
which is sorry to interrupt, which is suspicious in and of itself, because knowing how the federal government and the bureaucracy works, I believe they got it January 24th and they approved it the 26th or something like that.
Yeah, nothing moves that fast in DC.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly, there were a lot of, I wouldn't call them little, because at the end of the day, following the law is following the law. There were crimes committed. There were illegal things about every step of this process where, you know, for example, they gave 189 days. Legally, you're only allowed to give 180 days. So, you know, there were like math problems in the approval of the emergency that stuck out like a sore thumb of like, hey, you guys rushed this out and didn't really put any thought into following the law here, big picture or even in the small details. And so we get this survey, we read through it. It's fundamentally flawed on so many different levels, right? I think there's the threshold question of whether there should be a survey at all or not. And then there's the question of like what should be in the survey if there is going to be one. So, you know, as I mentioned, they were asking for extraneous information that was not electricity consumption data. Something that I thought about yesterday actually was they ask for your hash rate, but they don't ask you what you're hashing. So they're not asking you if you do SHA-256 squared for BTC, right? And unfortunately, there are other cryptocurrencies that are proof of work that have different hashing algorithms. And if you added up the different hashing algorithms, that's garbage, right? That doesn't make any sense, right? You can only add up SHA-256 squared for BTC. You can't add Script and, you know, Litecoin and Monero and whatever else is out there. Ethereum Classic, I think, is still proof of work. So they didn't put that much thought into that part. But they also ask for who is selling you your electricity. And that's a really inappropriate question.
Yeah, not only that, but not only who is selling you your electricity, but how much of their overall production are you buying from them? So they want you to like go to your electricity provider, have them dox their business essentially.
Yeah, and to me the biggest problem really, if there's going to be a survey, they didn't ask there were questions that they did not ask that they should have asked. So if you're looking at Bitcoin mining on the grid, so the first question you might ask is like, what's the total electricity consumption of Bitcoin mining? And that'll give you a particular view of what's going on. But crucially, what matters, if you're talking about a flexible load, is when were they consuming electricity? And when were they not consuming electricity? Because if the industry is saying, and academia for that matter, and legislators and policymakers are all pointing to the fact that Bitcoin miners are price responsive and are curtailing, then logically, and we're calling it a large flexible load, logically it would make sense that you would want to understand the truth of that, right? Not just the total consumption, but the timing of consumption. And other surveys have that. So if you're, so there's a survey for like natural gas power plants, right? Or wind and solar, right? They ask you like, when were you producing your electricity? Because the grid is a dynamic system. It's not like some static, system. And so I think the reason why they didn't ask that question is because they didn't want to know the answer, because it's exculpatory. It's showing that actually Bitcoin miners are not contributing to scarcity. They're not stressing the grid. They're doing the opposite of that. They are absorbing excess electrical production from wind and solar, where electricity price, it's not uncommon for it to be negative in Texas because too much electricity is being produced, right? Like that, I think, violates her narrative so much that they could not have that question in the survey. So when we looked at this survey and we saw that it was just purely pretextual, political, and that this just reflected weaponization of what should be an independent agency, a nonpartisan agency, that was being hijacked, and that the whole process was illegal and rogue, right? Like they were just breaking laws because, well, and let's back up and ask ourselves, like, would they do this to any other industry? And the answer is no. And that they see Bitcoin miners as not a legitimate industry. And this came out very clearly when Secretary Granholm said, a lot of these Bitcoin miners are underground. Now, that's not possible. Okay, that's not possible.
She mean that figuratively or like?
No, figuratively. Okay. I mean, it would be funny if it was literally like that. I remember there was a congressperson who was concerned about an island capsizing because they thought that it was a ship. But no, I let's give her the benefit of the doubt and say figuratively. Although it would be interesting to have literally underground Bitcoin mining facilities.
Good security.
Great security, resistant to EMP attacks, combine it with geothermal energy, right? Like now you've got your whole self-contained facility underground. Like, I like the way she's thinking.
At scale.
At scale.
When the hashing wars really heat up, you're going to want some underground mining operations.
What she means is that they're off the radar, right? That there's no visibility on them, which is impossible. It's impossible on two levels. One is that if you're connecting to the grid, you are known. In fact, there was a great paper out of Texas A&M that showed that grid operators can very easily identify where Bitcoin miners are on the grid because Bitcoin mining has a particular electrical signature. Mm-hmm. Right. And so and they showed that you can, with a 98% accuracy, you can know exactly how much Bitcoin mining is going on your grid, even at the residential level. All right. So there's no way that there's any kind of underground grid mining happening. And if there is, I mean, they're stealing electricity. Right. And so that's already illegal. Now, I think that maybe what she was referring to is the flared gas mining that's off grid. which is great for the environment, right? Because they are preventing kind of just burning this excess natural gas. And that, if that's, remove the if. That is already regulated. Okay, so there are already air quality regulations around, running a genset in the oil field. You're not doing that underground. That is, that gets inspected, right? So there's not. I don't think that there is any underground mining happening in the United States. Maybe there are in other countries that I don't know. I mean, it's like if the government of Venezuela is mining Bitcoin, secretly, like I agree that with Secretary Granholm that we should nuke them, but no, I'm kidding. Look, difficulty's increasing too much, man. We got to start firing back.
The hash wars.
Yeah, hash wars. Like, let's get kinetic here.
It's like that, and then like even off grid, like that's. Even if it's not flared gas, like so my personal miners are on a stranded natural gas well with the genset, and we had to get permitting for the genset. We make revenue that I report to the IRS and pay the taxes on. Like it's off grid, but it's not underground. It's very above ground.
Right. Yeah. But what it showed was her bias, right? And so they do view this industry as being criminal and illegitimate, and that essentially from their perspective, what they're doing is that they want to get evidence of all of this crime, right? And so that's what they're doing. Now, that might work inside of their little echo chamber. Doesn't work in federal court, because in federal court, you actually do have to have like a crime being committed, not, your feelings about Bitcoin, and so, what we decided to do was, rather than send in a response that we felt like, one, opened us up to liability because it was so poorly worded. Most of the words were not defined, and so it wasn't really clear what they were asking for in many regards. And then they say, hey, if you answer the wrong question, that's a crime. Mm-hmm. And you could face jail time and fines if you give us the wrong answer.
Yeah, and if you don't answer, that's a crime.
Right.
We're going to fine you, and you could face jail time as well.
And I think part of it was their hope that Bitcoin miners would fill this out, and then they would pop them on some technicalities and, essentially be able to persecute Bitcoin miners based off of just this paperwork. It would really violate our fiduciary duty to the shareholders to not push back on this. And so, first of all, we pushed back on it kind of in behind closed doors, like in background of like informal conversations with EIA of like, we can't do this. Like, let's find a different path forward. And then when that fell on deaf ears, well, yeah, we got to go to federal court and file a complaint and get a restraining order so that they have to stop the survey. So the day before it was due, because, the other thing was that we didn't have a lot of time. As Elizabeth Warren said in the hearing, TikTok.
She did say that.
Yeah,
I didn't catch that.
Yeah. And I felt like she was appropriating Bitcoin culture. TikTok next block.
She's known for appropriating cultures.
Yeah.
So shouldn't be shocking.
Shouldn't be shocking. We're not going back to the wampum. I'm sorry. Okay, we're moving forward. We're not going back. Okay, so by the time we got everything put together with the lawyers, it was like the day before the survey was legally, due, and so filed it in the 5th District, which is federal district court in Waco specifically, because our facility is over in Rockdale. So that's really kind of the court of jurisdiction is Waco. Waco is famous for a lot of different reasons. if the Bitcoin cult is going to defend itself against the federal government, it's going to be in Waco.
This is a big win against the federal government in Waco.
Yeah.
Not known for winning against the federal government.
And there's cult leaders with compounds, etc. But anyway, there's a home renovation thing. I don't know if you know about these.
Yes. They're very good at what they do.
Yeah, big in Waco. So anyway, so I essentially, I get a call of like, hey, put on a suit, drive to Waco, and I wasn't opposed to that, but it did take me by surprise of like, oh, okay, this is happening. And so drive up there. Now, I got to give massive kudos to Lee Bratcher from Texas Blockchain Council. He really united the industry, united the trade associations, worked closely with Digital Chamber of Commerce, Perry Ann Boring, to make sure that we were all aligned on this strategy, because you can imagine that there's, different perspectives on how we should interact with regulators. And I think the presumption should be that we want to work with regulators in order to get to win-win, good outcomes. And that dragging them into court should be the last resort. And this is where we were at, was the last resort. And yeah.
And so what happened? 'Cause I remember we spoke last week. It was before the hearing that did not materialize on Wednesday.
Yeah.
So they nixed the hearing. What happened between Monday
so this
and Wednesday
was
last week?
Yeah. So this was essentially the Friday before that. Sit down in the courtroom. It's a lot like pews in a church, which I don't know. I didn't feel, kind of felt blasphemous. But anyway, but the presiding judge, Alan Albright, fairly recently appointed by President Trump. And he's interesting because, people would think, oh, he's like right-wing MAGA. But the reality is that he has ruled against, let's say, conservatives in the past. And so he's very, let's follow the law. He's not trying to like pick sides or anything. And he was asking questions to the attorneys. We've got our attorneys, and then the Department of Justice was there representing the Department of Energy, and then he puts it this way. He's like, "Okay, do you guys want to figure out some kind of agreement and negotiate something, or do you want me to write a temporary restraining order and stop the Department of Energy?" And so, we're like, yeah, let's find an agreement. All right. So let's, and the government said, yeah, okay. Well, let's find an agreement, because essentially what Judge Albright was saying is, hey, Biden administration, do you want to do this the easy way or the hard way? Like, do you want me to force you to surrender, or do you want to like find some terms to surrender on? And so, I think that they saw the writing on the wall, and they tried to negotiate something, but what they failed on was getting everyone on the government side to agree to surrender. So they weren't able to find a way to get a binding agreement on all of the government parties, so that even if EIA agrees, they still have to get Department of Energy to agree, and they got to get OMB to agree to the settlement, and that didn't work out. And so the judge put a temporary restraining order on them, and in that on Friday, and then in that order he made it clear that from the filings that had been made, because when we filed our lawsuit, we explained what Bitcoin is, explained what proof of work is, what Bitcoin mining is, what a flexible load is. We pointed to all of the information that had been requested by Elizabeth Warren in the past. We pointed to all the academic research that had been done that shows that, hey, this is actually, it's not a public harm at all. It's actually a public good. And that this emergency was fabricated. They were just crying wolf, and that it was all pretextual and political, and that they were weaponizing an agency and committing crimes in order to attack Bitcoin. And the judge said, hey, look, like, more likely than not, the Bitcoin miners are right. And so putting on this temporary restraining order, and let's come back next week on Wednesday and we'll have a hearing. And that hearing would be for an injunction, which would basically, make things permanent of, hey, you guys are not allowed to do it this way. Now, before the hearing, it got canceled because we finally did get to a binding agreement with all parties. And that basically said that, one, all of the data that they had collected, and I don't know who sent in data. Come on, guys. Like,
I have a few companies in mind that I know.
Let's not name names, but yeah. So that data got destroyed.
Thank God.
And then second is that they had to start over, and they had to do it the non-emergency way of providing public notice and a comment period for people to provide feedback on the survey, and that they had to pay our attorney fees for being a nuisance. And so what this established was that, first of all, the Bitcoin mining industry is not some kind of second-class citizen that lacks the rights of any other industry, right? We're a legitimate stakeholder in any kind of policymaking process, and if we're not treated that way, then we will have to litigate, right? And we will win in court because the truth is on our side. That's what I love about this. Like, going into court, I was like, there's no way we lose here, because we have all the facts. And what they have is speculative science fiction of, well, what if,
Well, the facts, and you shared the chart, is ERCOT chart of large flexible load reaction to Winter Storm Heather, I believe it was called.
Yeah.
During times of peak demand. And it's like, that's actually one thing. I knew the Bitcoin miners were a large percentage of large flexible load capacity within ERCOT, but I didn't know it was more than 95%. I thought it was close to like 60 to 80%. But essentially, all the large flexible load within ERCOT are Bitcoin miners.
That's right. And, we hear stories about like hydrogen electrolyzers being large flexible loads. And from what I've heard, like, one, they're not large. They could be large at some point in the future, hypothetically, but today they're actually very small. And then two, they're not super flexible in the sense that I asked one of the hydrogen guys, I asked him, like, what is your break even? And then he started hemming and hawing about it depends. And I'm like, all right, well, I can tell you, like, Bitcoin mining break evens between, like, let's say $80, $120, based on current prices. So if you don't have like a pretty firm break even, then you're just like a chemical plant or any other consumer, where it's like, yeah, at some price you're not going to consume, but you're not flexible like Bitcoin miners are. Anyway, sorry to rant about the hydrogen people, but
no, but I think it's important to highlight, like, the large flexible load engaging in this demand response program is massively beneficial to the stability of the grid, and not only the stability of the delivery of electricity to residential consumers, but the stability of prices that those consumers are paying as well.
Yeah.
Relative stability.
Yeah. So now they have yet to resubmit the survey.
Quick break here, freaks. This rip is brought to you by Gradually Then Suddenly, a framework for understanding Bitcoin as money by Parker Lewis. I wrote the foreword to the book. I'm honored to have done so because it's the best 0-to-1 primer if you're looking for a logical explanation of why Bitcoin obsoletes all other money. Buy one for yourself and maybe a few for your friends. Go to thesafehouse.com/gradually. That's thesafehouse.com, safe spelled SAIF, thesafehouse.com/gradually. Use the promo code TFTC for $5 off at checkout. Buy it now, freaks. The price of Bitcoin is going up. You need to understand it. This is the best 0-to-1 primer. Back to the show.
Well, how much of this do you think is driven by the fact that it's an election year too? They feel, like, do you think there's a sense of you could have a new administration come in and things could change from the political perspective. We may not have as much power 9 months from now, so we need to do this now.
I think this is entirely driven by Elizabeth Warren.
Yeah.
So if John Deaton wins in Massachusetts, that would be great. It seems like it's unlikely that he will win, but
what are the people in Massachusetts doing? What is she?
I don't know. I mean, Massachusetts has elected statewide Republicans before. Like, they've had Republican governors, like, semi-recently. So it's not out of the question that she would actually lose the election. But, you know, she's got a brand name, and...
Is it a good brand, though?
Among progressives, she has tricked them.
Okay.
She's tricked them into thinking that she's on their side. You know, she used to be a Republican, by the way.
She did?
Yeah.
I did not realize that.
Yeah.
Did not know that.
Yeah, I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions about Elizabeth Warren that we don't really have solid answers on.
No. And she's old, too. She's one of those, she's pushing 70, right?
Look, I'm not, that I won't comment on. I mean, look, I'm starting to get old, too.
It's a line too far.
Yeah, you know, some people say, Pierre, you're too old for this game. I'm like, hey, you know, respect pops here. I'm starting to get gray hairs. Got more last week. But, you know, so she is at odds with the Biden administration on a lot of these topics, in the sense that even with the money laundering part, you know, Treasury was like, what are you talking about? You know, like, first of all, the Biden administration has given Iran billions of dollars. So some of that money goes to Hamas, and they probably don't want to, like,
admit that.
They don't want to start that conversation, right? They'd rather talk about other things. And that on even on this EIA survey, like, they have been pressured to do this for the past 2 years, and then when they did it, they kind of just mailed it in, so to speak. So I think that she is the primary driver behind this, and so either she gets discredited and people stop listening to her at the Biden administration, or that there's a new administration in place where, you know, it would really fall on deaf ears. But, you know, let's keep in mind that there are Republicans as well who are skeptical of Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining, including here in Texas, right? So the legislation that we saw proposed last year in the Texas Senate by Lois Kolkhorst, you know, she's a Republican, and yet she failed to see that she was attacking kind of the best hope we have for liberty and for Texas.
Yeah, and our good friend Parker Lewis did the equivalent of a FOIA request at the Texas state level and found some interesting information. Apparently there was no emails about this particular bill that were ever sent or discussed publicly, so it seems like there were some conversations outside of the view of the public that led to that bill getting presented.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of an odd bill because it wasn't saying, like, no more Bitcoin mining or anything like that. It was saying Bitcoin miners should not be allowed to compete in ancillary services with
big battery.
With big battery, and there's other players in there. There's peaker plants. There's industrials in there as well. But it did seem like it was what's called a vendor bill, which is, okay, you're just trying to give an edge to some industry, and you're handicapping another industry for no public policy, like no valid reason.
Yeah, which is a real shame to see, because I think we can all succeed, whether it's the Bitcoin miners, the peaker plants. We should spin the peaker plants up and mine Bitcoin with them when you don't need them. Yeah,
absolutely. And even the batteries, I look at the ERCOT website every day, and they've got a chart there that shows, you know, whether batteries are charging and discharging. They're quite often, like, Bitcoin miners are mining using battery power, right? Because the electricity price is elevated, but it's not higher than the break even for Bitcoin miners, and a battery might be like, based on the data, there are batteries that are discharging at those times, and where it's like, yeah, okay, well, it's part of the grid mix that is going into Bitcoin mining. And so, you know, Bitcoin miners are a customer for batteries. And they should kind of have a growing pie mentality rather than how do we rile up populist senators to attack one of the highest growth industries in the state?
Yeah. And I think that's the big overarching problem that we have. Not only, I think it's less pronounced in Texas, but at the national level, which is this aversion to energy abundance.
Yeah, so we've entered into the scarcity mindset that we got to conserve electricity, and this does come out of the 1970s. There was a book called like Small is Beautiful. It was like this. We need to like return to nature, right? We need to consume less, and it's fine to have that minimalist perspective on an individual level, but to try to foist it onto society because you're having an anxiety attack about, that's not okay. And the other thing too is that there are legitimate concerns about pollution, right? And so I'd love it if all of the energy that goes into worrying about electricity consumption went into worrying about microplastics, right? So I think that also
it's causing a lot of cancer.
Yes, and cleaning up pollution is energy intensive, right? So water filtration, energy intensive. We better have a lot of energy if we want to be able to desalinate water, right? And create resource abundance writ large. And so this anti-energy ideology, I think that on a national and frankly international level, because it's not specific to the U.S., I think it's specific to the West. Because look at China. I mean, they're building coal-fired power plants every day. They don't care about this.
I think they spun up like 600 megawatts worth of.
Yeah.
Or they're doing that like every month.
Yeah.
And they're spinning up nuclear too.
And something we saw in Europe was that Russia was funding environmentalist groups to fight against fracking so that Europe would have to buy natural gas from Russia, right? So when we look at what environmentalists say, we should kind of have an adversarial mindset of, okay, are you being funded by our enemies in order to sabotage the West?
Russian spies?
Yeah.
The Russian provocateurs?
Because at the end of the day, they're telling us that we need to impoverish ourselves.
Yes. And in the case of Germany and Western Europe particularly, the last 3 years, more pronounced in 2022 and 2023, particularly after the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up. Like they had just decommissioned a bunch of coal and nuclear power plants for this green energy transition that doesn't materialize. Apparently, it's not windy or sunny in Germany. It's not conducive for a reliable grid to rely on wind and solar power there. And the result of that was them spinning coal power plants back up, but they had a problem with the Rhine. They couldn't actually get the coal up to the factories because the Rhine was too low. And so what did they do? They cut down forest in North Carolina.
Well, biomass is renewable.
and that's how insane it is. They're cutting down forest over here in the United States. We're creating wood pellets, shipping it over to Europe on diesel-fueled ships, and then they were loading up the power facilities with pellets and burning wood.
It's so absurd. And even here in the U.S., New York's carbon intensity per megawatt has increased, and it is now greater than Texas's carbon intensity per megawatt because they shut down.
Driven by Indian Point?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that from a policy perspective, it's just like cell phones, right? Like they're not achieving, because it's just virtue signaling, right? Like they say one thing, but then they are incompetent, and so their actions cause the opposite. Now, I'm assuming they're incompetent and they're not malicious. It's
being generous, I would say.
Perhaps. Yeah. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but I think so. I think it's time for change, right? Like and I'd liken it to like these people are in a cult and they need to be deprogrammed. Like they need to go to re-education camps and learn to, like I think Steve Barber should run a re-education camp, and so that he can teach journalists to love coal.
Yes. I think it's not even journalists. Like I've been talking about this a lot in the Bitcoin. Obviously, once you find Bitcoin, you discover an applicable sound money in the real world, learn about distributed systems. Like, hey, why don't we learn about sound money in high school? Now, having been involved with Bitcoin mining for 6 years, I think just as equally as important to educate young Americans about monetary policy is energy and how these things work. Like, how do these lights turn on? Like, what is the process that leads from fuel resources being extracted into the ground, being catalyzed to create electricity, and then delivered to this building to give us the lights, the mics, the computer? Like,
yeah, we take it for granted until we don't have it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what kind of drove so much public animus after Winter Storm Uri. I was at home with my family with a newborn baby. The power was out and our water stopped working. That's a survival, and the roads were frozen. So it's like a survival situation where it's like the grid, electricity is it's the layer zero of civilization. We cannot have civilization without electricity. And to me, what's astonishing is that you have people putting all of their bets on wind and solar. And during this AI data course I was taking, we talked about, trying to predict, the wind and the sun, right? And these natural systems have very fat tails, right? They're not like thin tail, like normal distributions. So you can look at it of like, well, on average, it is sunny and windy. But if you're going to operate the grid, you can't operate on an average, right? You have to operate on 100% of the time. And so when you look at these probability distributions, and sometimes they're like, hey, look, we can't quantify the probability because it's uncertainty. It's not even, it's like a qualitative thing, right? And because at the end of the day, it's up to God whether there's wind, whether there's clouds.
Well, the particularly for solar, which is where I'm not as generous in labeling it as incompetence, because you have this massive push for this transition to wind and solar. Then literally at the same time, the Biden administration's coming out and it's like, we need to put metals in the air to blot out the sun to cool down the planet. Like, they're literally saying, we're going to transition to solar and then we're going to blot out the sun to cool the planet at the same time.
That might create a challenge.
Yes.
Yeah, and so you could, so the idea that we're going to be wind and solar, and that also at the same time that grid reliability is the number one priority, that doesn't mesh well. And so if I was talking with the Department of Energy and the EIA, and we were trying to identify what's an emergency right now, I think the emergency is the lack of natural gas dispatchable thermal generation in Texas.
Yeah.
And I think that emergency has been recognized by the Texas House, the Texas Senate, the governor of Texas, and the voters of Texas who voted in a referendum to promote more construction of natural gas plants in Texas. Now, what's really fascinating is that adjacent to Riot's Rockdale facility, we recently saw an announcement that there is going to be a natural gas plant built there. And it's not a peaker plant. It is a combined cycle gas turbine that, will be base load that is, I think it's 1.6 gigawatts.
Nice.
And what I love about natural gas that I didn't know before getting into this industry was that these power plants use the equivalent of a jet engine bolted to the ground to generate electricity. And I just love that idea because I've flown in planes a good amount in my life, traveling between France and the United States. And I've always found like jet engines to be like a modern marvel of how they work. Way better than propellers. Sorry for those propeller maxis out there. But why are they building a giant natural gas power plant, in Rockdale? Lots of different reasons. I mean, there's a semiconductor Samsung fabrication plant that's getting stood up. There's just general increase in load from population. But, it has to be a factor in their minds that, hey, look, we will have an off-taker, right, of Bitcoin miners. And so Bitcoin mining is a way of attracting, I think, that kind of baseload at scale generation. That way, we don't have to subsidize it from a taxpayer perspective. And the other part of it too is that why does Texas have to build? Or why does Texas have to subsidize natural gas power plants? Well, it's to offset the fact that the federal government is subsidizing wind and solar.
Yeah, the renewable energy credits.
Yeah.
It's a big problem.
It is. It's a huge problem. And then they actually, because of the intermittency of wind and solar, that contributes to needing to procure more ancillary services as well. And so and it also contributes to the fact that, you get $5,000 a megawatt when the sun is setting, there's no wind, and people are turning on their AC.
And you tweet it out almost every day now, and you look at those charts around this period of time when the sun goes down, you look at the natural gas ramp up to serve electricity to the grid. It's
a modern marvel.
It really is.
It's astonishing what they're able, and it's so smoothly, they cut through it like butter. The most absurd thing, in my opinion, that happened with the litigation that we just had was the Sierra Club comes in and they're like, hey, we've got an amicus brief. Can we file it? Can we file our amicus brief? It's like, okay, first of all, nobody asked you. And then I read through their amicus brief. It is the most absurd document I've ever seen filed in federal court. I mean, arguably they perjured themselves and they did something illegal and they should go to jail or something, because they've got things in there like, oh, the volatility of electricity prices in Texas is caused by the volatility of natural gas prices. And I'm looking at natural gas prices. They're at historic lows. I mean, they're at all-time lows. Like, natural gas traders are, crying. They're...
Well, they didn't even come into to attack Bitcoin miners. They came in to attack the natural gas industry.
They had look, it's a Sierra Club. Like they've got their shibboleths, they've got their, they probably copy pasted from some other documents of they're just spamming people, right? They're not actually, good faith, interested in the topic. So they included that in there of because basically their argument is that this price responsiveness is the price being responded to is caused by natural gas, which is completely absurd because when we look at when our electricity price is elevated in Texas, it's not when natural gas prices are elevated. It's when specifically there's an underproduction of renewables because there's no wind or solar, or there's no wind or sun, and with natural gas prices going down, really, what we would expect to see, and natural gas prices are not that volatile, right? So if it is 6 p.m. and the price of electricity goes from $100 a megawatt to $5,000 a megawatt, back to $100 a megawatt, the price of natural gas did not move during that 1 hour, right? Sierra Club was just completely off the reservation here because they can't bring themselves to admit that the electricity price volatility is due to the volatility of intermittent generation.
Well, it doesn't only create that price variability, but another problem, I was talking to Jamie McCavity from Corman about this last month, which I didn't realize, is it creates a transmission voltage synchronization problem because in the natural gas turbines, the nuclear power plant turbines, the coal turbines, that's synchronized with the voltage that's being sent out to the grid.
It's spinning at 60 hertz.
Yes.
And wind and solar are what's called inverter-based resources. And so they have to essentially have electrical equipment that converts the electricity to go onto the grid. So from DC to AC. The problem with that is that, as Jamie was pointing out, you get power quality issues from that kind of resource. And this is well known within the industry in the sense that the regulators are proposing tighter standards for inverter-based resources so that they are better grid citizens and have higher quality inverters. And the renewables industry is pushing back on that, is saying that's too expensive. It's like,
well, it's a systemic risk because you could short the grid if you're not synchronized, right?
Absolutely. I mean, so these voltage disturbances then cause problems for loads, and they cause problem for any kind of electrical equipment, and out in West Texas, they've got to build essentially ways of compensating for that to improve the power quality, and so and that's at the like sub-second level, and then at the second by second level, you've got. I'm a sailor, right? So I love going out and sailing, and any sailor worth their salt, although I'm more of a freshwater sailor, knows that there are puffs of wind, right? So there are little areas where you'll see that there's a little bit more wind, and a big part of sailing strategy is getting into those puffs and going a little bit faster than your competitor, and they come and go, right? And they move around, and it's all very random, right? Because that's just how God operates. And then furthermore, if we look at solar, there's cloud coverage coming in and out. So these create little variations in the electrical output that you don't have with a nuclear power plant or, with a natural gas power plant, et cetera. And so all of that then means that from a grid operator perspective, you have to be offsetting those changes by paying somebody else to fill in the gaps, and to, create a steady system. And so that's at the second by second level. And then obviously by hour, you can have the wind go away or come back completely. And so then you need to be spinning up a turbine or turning it off. And that also costs money, right? So the negative externalities of intermittent inverter-based resources are not fully priced into how they integrate with the grid.
No. And again, going back to renewable energy credits, I think it's a existential threat to the stability of the grids because you're disincentivizing the production of natural gas power plants, nuclear power plants, coal power plants, because they can't compete because of the subsidies driving down prices to negative levels.
So there's that part that is also not priced in, which is huge. And I think that essentially they get when they connect to the grid, they are part of this network where they get the price that usually the marginal price is set by natural gas generators, that they're the marginal price setter. And so everybody gets that price. And so renewables get that marginal price, even though it's not really reflective of their cost, right? Their fuel cost is zero, right? And so there is a very weird economic thing of by connecting to the grid, they are free riding off of the price formation that, for the most part, outside of scarcity conditions, is being driven by natural gas. And then the other part of it too. There was another part of it. I'm trying to remember now, of the negative externality. Well, we'll edit this part out.
Negative pricing. We don't edit, so.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is it's an existential crisis, and Bitcoin mining can actually help this, right? Because if you have negative pricing, just put a large Bitcoin mining operation behind the meter and mine Bitcoin when those prices are negative.
That's right.
Yeah.
The other part is the transmission, right? Yes. So they are creating this huge demand for additional transmission, and then that cost gets spread over the whole system. And so it's like, well, hold on.
More freeloading.
Right. Yeah. They should have to, if they had to pay for that, then suddenly their project becomes uneconomical.
Yeah. Is there room for wind and solar?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And the way we would know how much room there is would be by not having these production tax credits in the federal tax code. And look, yes, solar has gotten very cost competitive, but you still have to firm it up with something. And then once you firm it up of solar plus battery, well, now it's not so cost competitive. Now you're looking at, well, maybe it makes more sense to build a nuclear power plant. But look, it also depends of, okay, if you're in a area where realistically you're not going to hire nuclear engineers, you're in a rural area, you don't need a ton of electricity, you don't need a big nuclear power plant, or you're in space, right? Like you need it just makes more sense to have a solar panel. So there's definitely context where it makes sense, but I think that these resources would not be 50% of the grid with absent the myriad of subsidies that they receive. They'd be a much smaller percentage. And, the renewables industry would agree with that, because one of their big concerns is, hey, what if the production tax credit goes away? Right. And so obviously these decisions are tax driven, and they'll say, oh, it's the lowest cost. It's the lowest cost technology. It's like, oh, okay, so you don't need subsidies. And then they're like,
yeah. What's really frustrating, particularly down here in Texas, but again, it's really driven by these federal subsidies, is that we have a case study of this being an abysmal policy in Germany. I mean, if you look at the generation capacity mix in Germany in 2002, it was 86% reliable sources defined as nuclear, natural gas, coal. I believe, they had 96 gigawatts of reliable capacity, and then the rest of the 14% above that was wind and solar. They doubled the generation capacity on their grid between 2002 and 2022. Went from, I believe, 115 gigawatts of total capacity to 141. So they more than doubled capacity, but the actual generation fell by 2%, from 53 terawatt hours per year to 51. And the price of electricity went up 186% over that period.
Yeah, and this is where, utilization is such an important metric, right? If you want to be capital efficient, you have to have a high level of utilization. So if we concede to the renewables people of like, all right, sure, you want this policy direction, right? You want to decarbonize the grid. All right, let's just accept your premise. Then why are you attacking Bitcoin miners? Because Bitcoin miners are actually helping you. And this is a criticism of Bitcoin miners I've heard from others as well of like, hey, it's not good that Bitcoin miners are helping this because it's causing problems. Yes.
I don't think we should be leading with that narrative. Like, this is going to create grid problems, which will come back to bite us in the ass down the road.
So I just think that the renewables people should be promoting Bitcoin mining, and just, they should be leading with the narrative of, hey, we need more Bitcoin mining to help offset our intermittent generation. But because of ideological reasons unrelated to anything in the power industry, they don't like Bitcoin.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. People really like having a money printer.
Yeah. It's just, it fixes a lot of their problems.
Yeah. Well, I mean, with that in mind, like, what are your thoughts of the current market, external to the mining industry?
It far surpasses my expectations on the ETF.
Yeah.
I thought the ETS would basically be a nothing burger. That, hey, look, like the cycles are driven by the halving. And the ETFs are going to kind of be a dud because we're not in a bull market, but that they will become popular in a bull market was kind of my thesis. And I turned out to be completely wrong, that they have made it so much easier to buy Bitcoin. And I should have known better, having worked at Kraken, that the existing solutions have a bit of friction to them, and that, people don't necessarily want to sign up and send their KYC AML information everywhere, and that if you have the ease of use of your brokerage account and, it's just like double click by this cheap ETF. Because I also thought that, anybody who wants exposure to Bitcoin, there was like the futures traded, the futures backed ETFs, right, that have a higher fee, but at the end of the day, like, I thought that, people are not very fee sensitive, but there's a number of things I missed. One is kind of the brand names, right? Like BlackRock, big brand name, big marketing team. They're on the phones. They're pounding the pavement, selling this product. And that demand driver, that's just something that has not existed before. And then also that they would add these ETFs to their other portfolios. Mm-hmm. And now what we have is just a constant TWAP buy bid going on that just mechanically is going to drive the price up, and that there's no end in sight because this is only going to accelerate. The ETFs are available on more and more platforms. I'm scared.
Well, you shouldn't be scared. I mean, in 2013, you wrote a very important piece in the Bitcoin canon, speculative attack. Maybe the ETFs aren't inciting this, but
I was joking about being scared. I mean, in the sense of like it's overwhelming. My body's not ready for the euphoria. Yeah.
Are we at the beginnings of a full blown speculative attack?
Yeah. So I think that we might be of kind of just the final boss. In that speculative attack article, people on Twitter are saying, no, call it speculative arbitrage so that we don't scare the fiat people. I'm like, hey, this is public. So, tweeting out that we should call it speculative arbitrage, not speculative attack. I mean, they're reading your tweet, right? So I don't think it's going to fool them. But anyway, there's always people who are like, we shouldn't call it Bitcoin. It's like we need to rebrand it because Bitcoin is too blah, 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 right? Or they're like, and I've been guilty of this as well. Like, we shouldn't call it maximalism. We need to rebrand it to minimalism. It's like, or rationalism or whatever. It's
realism.
Realism. That never catches on, right? No, you're still a Bitcoin maxi. Sorry. Or Bitcoin mining. I was like, no, it's not Bitcoin mining. It's Bitcoin hashing, right? Because mining is like you're talking about mineral extraction. No, didn't work out. The other thing is speculative attack. That term was come up with by Paul Krugman.
Yep.
And just like Bitcoin maximalism was come up by Vitalik. And so I think that ultimately our enemies are going to come up with... Now, Krugman was not talking about Bitcoin mining when he talked about speculative attacks, but he was talking about speculators. And, he's not... I think he's not a huge fan of speculators. In that article, though, and folks, go Google speculative attack, Pierre Rochard, read the article.
I've been sending it out to people recently.
Very good. I mentioned that, there's a certain amount of liquidity that is a prerequisite for this working. And so we need to have like global liquid trading of Bitcoin. And I thought that maybe we'd get there with Coinbase, but and to their credit, Coinbase is a provider of infrastructure to a lot of the ETFs. But it really does, I think, take getting onto the big platforms to have enough liquidity to have a speculative attack, because what you need is the ability to create fiat. And the way that one creates fiat in the fiat system is by borrowing it from the commercial banking system. And I think that the ETFs open that up, and we're starting to see the banks say, hey, in the past, we have not been able to touch Bitcoin due to, the fiat maxi overlords. But because BlackRock and everyone else can get their hands on Bitcoin, we're at a disadvantage competitively. And it's not fair. We need to level the playing field and allow everybody to, be able to use Bitcoin. And so I think that we're starting to see a move in that direction. And so now I think that we've got a lot more clarity on the path to hyper-Bitcoinization completion. Right? Because obviously we've been in hyper-Bitcoinization for 15 years now, right? Mm-hmm. You don't go from a $0 to a $1 trillion market cap and not call that hyper-Bitcoinization.
Bitcoin's the 5th largest base money in the world.
Yeah. In an astonishingly short period of time, given that human civilization has only been around for 1,000 years or whatever. So, yes, The answer is yes. And now we gotta caution people. There are going to be big drawdowns, right? So it's not going to be a straight line up and to the right. It's going to crash, obviously. So don't go crazy with leverage. Don't use leverage. Don't use the ETFs. Also, things might get hairy. So, learn how to use a cold card, learn how to use multi-sig, and get not your keys, not your Bitcoin, get it off the exchanges, because we're going to go in for a wild ride here.
How wild?
$1 million, is kind of my expectation for this cycle.
Really?
Absolutely. And arguably that's just naively conservative. Because of massive tailwinds. I think the biggest headwind, honestly, is the paper hands, the people who are the lettuce hands, the
Dave Portnoys of the world.
The Dave Portnoys of the world. Although I'd say not Dave, because he doesn't have any Bitcoin, so he can't sell.
It was funny. The first time we recorded was in his office.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So big shout out to Barstool. Huge fan.
I tried my best to teach him. I failed. I actually feel like a failure for not having properly convinced him.
Well, I think that orange pilling is an accretive, process over time. So in advertising, they say that the median consumer has to see an advertisement 6 times before they buy the product. So, you're one of those 6 times, right? And so eventually it does click. I recently saw the Dallas Mavericks guy.
Mark Cuban. Bitcoin's a store of value.
Yeah. Was that a deep fake or was that real?
It was on CNBC, unless the deep faker convinced CNBC that he was actually Mark Cuban. I think it was actually him. Because
there was a Janet Yellen deep fake that I fell for. Did you see that?
Yeah, you fell for that, did you?
I'm joking.
Yeah, I was gonna say. What did she say?
She said, so the council looked at creating crypto regulations, and they decided that they're not going to have any regulations. Instead, they're going to load a fat bag and send it to a $1 trillion market cap. I was just laughing hysterically.
I thought this was a meme, but it turns out you can go search the actual statement from the state of Arizona. They came out with an official statement hey, we want access to the Bitcoin ETFs to put in our pensions.
Yeah, so that's I think the huge tailwind is that you've got every single pension out there that is underfunded. They don't have enough assets to match their liabilities. They got to throw a Hail Mary, right? And so what's kind of the most likely pass is to just, hey, let's put 5% into Bitcoin ETF, and then if Janet Yellen sends it, then we'll be good. So there's that, and then there's going to be the sellers on the other side, which I think are the folks who have been accumulating over the past 15 years, and then they're going to look at, okay, well, does it make sense for me to pay off my parents' mortgage, or to send, my nieces and nephews through college, or to give to my favorite charity, or to buy a Lambo? There's lots of good reasons to rebalance and to sell. And so I do think that there will be sell pressure, but that the absolute tsunami of buying on the ETF side, and then also, to a much lesser extent, the halving. And to me, the absolute icing on the cake is where the dollar is at in its cycle. The Fed is signaling that they are stopping interest rate hikes. So logically, the next step is to have a financial crisis. So the banks are insolvent.
Then this announcement this week did something with they basically signaled treasuries are not risk-free assets. The banks are can we please not have to mark these a certain way because they're systemic risk, or not have to hold them as liquid reserves because they're dog shit.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's been years of no coiners telling us that Bitcoin's too volatile. Meanwhile, they were filling their bag with 0% 30-year bonds. And then, interest rates go up and they're insolvent, and then they're begging JPOW to print dollars to bail them out. The whole commercial real estate sector, that seems like it is going to torpedo the banks, and the treasury market, everything. So that, I think, is unfortunate, but it is a huge positive catalyst for Bitcoin, because it confirms a key part of the Bitcoin thesis, which is that humans are flawed. Humans cannot manage a currency. They will inevitably put themselves in a situation of hyperinflation, and that we need an algorithm to manage this. And so that, completely confirms the Bitcoin hypothesis.
Yes. I mean, all the data is on our side.
All the data is on our side, the science is on our side, and the experts are on our side.
Yes.
The real experts.
It's a very good time to be a Bitcoiner.
I love it. I mean, it's as we were saying earlier, it's a lot of work, but I think that the joy I get from kind of the Austrian economics part of me, right, which is that for my entire adult life, I have been a proponent of sound money and a critic of the fiat system. And to kind of see this getting vindicated and just kind of being in the mix of it, it's tremendously humbling, and it gives me tremendous joy.
There's never a boring day. I feel satisfied every day waking up, and
I feel exhausted.
It is exhausting. Yeah, that's what we were saying before we hit record. Like these last few weeks, arguably like the busiest of my life, just with the price going up. Things happening in the mining space, things happening on the venture side, the media side. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about, but it's invigorating. Yeah,
and I was supposed to go on a spiritual retreat with my good friend Michael Goldstein, and then I was like, I actually have to go speak at Empower in Houston.
I will be there too.
Yeah, so I'll see you there, but. So I need to rain check the spiritual retreat, to like a week later, or we'll find time to do it. But it is, it's a little bit overwhelming on some level.
Yeah, I mean, we've been preparing for this for over a decade now at this point, which is crazy to think.
Yes, it is. I started learning about Bitcoin at the end of 2012. Mm-hmm. So it has been 12 years now of obsessing about this, and I think about Bitcoin every day. It's like it's something that is in some ways all-consuming. But now that I have 3 kids, right? I started out in my Bitcoin journey with 0 kids. Now I got a wife and 3 kids, and when I get so much joy. My 6-year-old was asking me about the halving.
He was.
Yeah. So it's like, I was crying, he's going to live in such a wonderful world. Mm-hmm. What a lucky kid.
We're not at the point where our 4-year-old is asking about the halving, but his favorite books are the Bitcoin books. We got the Cash App Bitcoin book. We've got,
Bitcoin Money from Bitcoin Rabbi.
Bitcoin Rabbi. Yeah. We have that. It's a long book, but it's worth reading to your children.
Absolutely.
Blockchain for Babies, not really a Bitcoin book, but he gets the it's funny because that's the one where he actually follows along. He doesn't predict, but he jumps ahead and starts saying the next page, understanding distributed systems and peer-to-peer transactions. It's
I want to put out a signal out there to the audience. If anyone has the skill set to make more children's books, please do. Whether it's and for any child's age, but also, the coloring books, the activity books, mm-hmm. We need a plethora of those so that the kids can get smart, because they're not going to learn about this in school.
No. That's what I just, not Bitcoin related, but I just bought 100 lessons, how to teach your kid to read. I'm not confident that the schools are going to do that, so I got to sit down and teach my son how to read. May have to re-educate myself on how to read first, but just
yeah. Well, you can have the AI teach them or something. I don't know. But,
at some point.
Yeah.
It's been great. It's been too long.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This is great.
It's again, not to get too reminiscent, but thinking about the first time I recorded in Barstool's office. That was like a 4-hour, 3-part episode. Drank a lot of wine.
Oh, yeah.
We did not have any kids. We were living in New York, and now fast forward, you've been at Crack, and now you're at Riot. It's crazy to see where we've come from that.
I've got a beard now.
You've got a beard. The first time we met, we were walking around the Lower East Side drinking bone broth. Talking about accounting and Bitcoin. And
that's right.
Yeah.
Oh, man. Those were I don't want to say those were the days because, like, today's the day. But yeah, it's really, you know, someone asked me, like, why is it that, like, I have a reputation in the Bitcoin industry? And I'm just like, I don't know. It's just like, I just never went away. I just stuck around, is one explanation. But I sometimes feel more like a Bitcoin historian. You know, people bring something up and I'm like, oh yeah, that got discussed like 5 years ago. It's, you know, people are just rehashing all the same debates over and over.
I mean, I've talked about this with, I won't name his name particularly, but like back in like 2015, 2016, when the like Bitcoin Classic, Bitcoin XT debates started popping up. This individual was like, where the hell are Pierre and Bitstein? Like, we need them. And I believe he like DM'd both. He was like, get back on Twitter. I need you guys to put these big blockers in their spot. And certainly a historian, but again, Nakamoto Institute, the mempool series, pivotal for my understanding of Bitcoin. And still to this day, I was telling him, literally, somebody's like, I got to pay off my mortgage before I start buying Bitcoin. And I sent him speculative attack. I was like, pay as little of your mortgage as possible that you can. Start buying Bitcoin.
Be financially responsible, folks.
Yes.
But also, you know, borrow as much money. You know, Michael Saylor got some grief for that. You know, it's funny because people were like, you know, he said to take out a mortgage and the Bitcoin price was, you know, at $60,000 at the time. Okay, here we are today. The Bitcoin price is back to $60,000. Where are mortgage interest rates?
8%.
Yeah. Back then they were at 3.5%. So Michael Saylor's advice was 100% right.
Sound advice.
And the critics are absolute idiots yet again.
Yes. Yeah. We've got the experts. We've got the data. Yeah. We've got the truth on our side. We're going to win.
We're going to win.
We're winning.
We just got to do the work.
Yes. Speaking of that, let's get back to work, Pierre.
Let's get back to work. Well, this was work, but yeah, let's get back to work. Yeah. Real work.
Peace and love, freaks.